So we live in the world of information overload. There's too much information. We're being exposed for WhatsApp groups, Facebook page, Instagram accounts, TikTok, to too much information, not to mention traditional mainstream media. And I think that the idea of putting together HUJI Forum that allows friends of the university and the community at large to get to hear people that this is their job, this is what they do, this is their expertise, I think it's a great idea, and it's such an honor to be part of it. I spent the vast majority of my life working as a diplomat, dealing with geopolitical issues. I participated personally in negotiating with the Palestinians, and then of course I was engaged in decades-long effort to promote Israel in the Jewish world and beyond through the celebration of Israel's soft power, what we call Israel as a brand, the celebration of Israel's competitive edge and relative advantages. So for me, it's a great opportunity to speak to HUJI Forum about my areas of expertise. And I'm so delighted to have been given the opportunity to sit here and share my thoughts with you. One of the most common misperceptions since October 7th, 2023, is that people think that what they're seeing is part of a century-old conflict between the Jewish people or the Zionist movement and the Palestinian national movement. Now, indeed, there is a conflict between these two conflicting, clashing national narratives, between the narrative of those who support Jewish self-determination, meaning the Zionists, that see themselves as the real indigenous people of the region. If you've been to Jerusalem and you looked at the digging in the Western Wall area, you know that the Jews are the indigenous people of the region. And then on the other side, you have millions of Palestinians that claim that they also have the right to have national self-determination. However, 10/7 has nothing to do with that. 10/7 was carried out by Hamas. Hamas is a radical, jihadist, Islamist organization. Now, what is Islamism? Islamism is the deployment and the exploitation of Islam for the fulfillment of political goals. From that perspective, Hamas is no different than all other Islamist organizations that we're familiar with here in the West, like ISIS, famous for its beheadings and the murder and the mutilation of Yazidi women in Iraq. Boko Haram, famous for abducting 300 girls in Nigeria. Al-Qaeda, of course, famous for carrying out 9/11 and the aftermath. Taliban was controlling Afghanistan, and the list goes on and on and on. And of course, the Islamic Brothers in Egypt, the Islamic Jihad in Gaza, which is an offspring of Islamic Brothers, and of course, Hamas. In other words, the conflict between Israel and Hamas erupted on 10/7, imposed on Israel by Hamas on 10/7, is a manifestation of an inter-civilizational clash between radical Islam and the rest of the world. If you may, it's the West versus the rest. So that's the first observation. What you're seeing has nothing to do with the national aspirations of the Palestinian people. It has everything to do with the radical goals of Islamism as represented by the radical regime of the Islamic Revolution in Iran. "10/7 is a manifestation of a much larger effort to undermine the dominance of the United States. Now, why the United States is so dominant? Since the end of the Cold War in the late 1980s, early 1990s, the United States emerged as the most dominant force in the world, not because it has the largest military, and it does have the largest military, not because it has the mightiest economy, and it does have the mightiest economy, but mainly because the United States is dominating the world through its what's called soft power. What is soft power? Soft power these are the elements that create attraction. We are attracted to the American culture because of American soft power. The ability, for example, to solve problems, health-related problems, technological problems, the ability to come up with knowledge, to produce knowledge that matters, knowledge that changes the world. I teach my students about marketing and branding, and every year I show them the list of the top 100 strongest brand names in the world. And guess what? Around 80% of them are American brands. Yeah, you'll find a couple of Chinese brands, even Swedish brands. What you will not find on the list, even if you go 30 years back, you will not find one Russian brand. Now, that doesn't mean that there is no talent in Russia. There's a great deal of talent in Russia. But the Russian system does not excel in allowing creative minds to express their creativity. Ask Sergey Brin. He'll tell you what happens to someone like Sergey Brin when they move from Russia to the United States. What you get is Google. That's the whole difference. Now, of course, the Russians don't like it. They put together an axis that includes China, includes Iran, includes North Korea. Certainly, unfortunately, a new member of that anti-American axis is South Africa, that foolishly is betting on Russia against the United States, and Turkey. This is, and of course, Qatar can be included in that axis as well. This is the story. This is the story in Ukraine. This is the story in the Middle East. An effort led by Russia to undermine the positioning of the United States. Israel happens to be physically at the forefront of that struggle between the rest versus the West. And that's what you're looking at. Third observation, we're talking about what to do as a result of 10/7. 10/7 is an event, a watershed event, a perfect storm that made many people feel uncomfortable for supporting the kind of values represented by the State of Israel. So we see a surge in anti-Semitic efforts. We see demonstrations on campus supporting Hamas. How can that be? One explanation has a lot to do with what we call information overload. What is information overload? The human brain was designed to allow us to survive in nature. And the human brain is designed to handle 3 or 4 tasks simultaneously, again, that are meant to allow us to survive in nature. The human brain was never designed to handle hundreds of digital stimulations as we have to do these days with the advent of technology. What is the impact of this content barrage, onslaught, digital onslaught on the human brain? 2 things. The first is we are overwhelmed, naturally. As a result of the fact that we are overwhelmed, anxiety goes up. We have a tendency to make mistakes when we're anxious, but more importantly, when we're anxious and overwhelmed, we're craving simplicity in the face of growing complexity. There are many examples to that, but the most potent example is the rise in political populism. What is populism? Populism is the ability to encapsulate a highly complex message in one very short, abbreviated, concise expression. That's populism. We also see the rise in anti-state populism, meaning leaders that attack their own establishments. It's like an autoimmune disease. We see it all over the world. We see it in the United States. We see it in Europe. We see it even in Israel. Leaders that are attacking the Israeli government, for example, is very critical of the military right now. That's anti-state populism. So one of the explanations to what we're seeing today is information overload. Too much information. Most of it is irrelevant. The solution, of course, is to limit ourselves to the number of informational resources. I call it informational distancing. Just like during COVID, we had to practice physical distancing. We called it social distancing. Now we need to exercise informational distancing. Limit yourself to a very small number of informational resources, and that's it. Limit the amount of hours you spend every day in front of the screen. it will do wonders to you and to your mental health. And when it comes to Israel, what is the impact of information overload on the division of positions vis-a-vis Israel and the Middle East? Over the years, we studied the positioning of Israel, and we discovered that by and large, in the Western world, including in Canada, people are divided into three groups. I call it the 10-20-70 rule. Among the 10, you have the people that no matter what you try to sell them about Israel, they're not buying. Israel wants to make peace, it's not good enough. Israel wants to go to war, certainly not good. Whatever it is, you want to sell them Israeli technology, they're not buying. You want to sell them Israeli science, they're not buying. These are the people that don't believe that Israel has a right to exist. I would say that among those 10%, the majority of people do not support that extreme view, but those who do support certainly belong to the 10%. Traditionally, the approach was don't waste your time on the 10%. Because there's nothing you can do or say to convince them. Then you have the 20%. The 20% are the people that report strong emotional connection to Israel. When something happens in Israel, it's as if it happened to them. Of course, people that care about Israel. These are people that care about Israel religiously, politically, emotionally, personally, because they have friends. I know many Canadians that their connection to Israel is deep, simply because they have Israeli friends that live here in Canada or they live in Israel, doesn't matter. But then you have the 70%. The 70% are the majority. I call them the uninterested and the uninformed. These are the people that know absolutely nothing. When they hear about Israel versus Palestine, it's as if they heard about India versus Pakistan, or it's as if they heard about Turkey versus Greece. They don't really have a vested interest in the conflict. Now, the theory was that from purely a marketing point of view, from a strategic point of view, the goal of the Jewish community was to cultivate the 70%. This is our room to grow. These are the people we need to provide them with intimate knowledge of Israel, of the Hebrew University, for example, of Israel's contribution to the well-being of humanity through its great universities like the Hebrew University. And by doing so, we're going to provide them with more immune system, if you may, so that Israel's image, Israel's reputation will be more resilient because people know Israel. Let me give you a real-life example of what happens when you don't know. Look at Ukraine and American conservatives. American conservatives don't really have an emotional connection with Ukraine or its people, and therefore, in their eyes, in order to save some money, let's dump Ukraine. We have to be very aware of the Ukrainian example. Make sure that Israel never gets there. How to do that? By providing the 70% with enough information about the Israelis, their motivations, who they are, their values. Only by knowing Israelis personally, you can then develop a relationship with them. The best example is a rock band Radiohead. A lot of people don't know that Radiohead, before they became famous, they used to perform in Israel. It was one of the few places there was an Israeli DJ. They used to play their songs regularly. And they would come to Israel and perform in front of full houses when no one ever heard of them in England. And so they became familiar with their Israeli fans. In fact, one of the members of the band married an Israeli woman. Now they know Israel. No one can tell them that Israel is performing genocide in Gaza. They know Israelis. They know that what's happening in Gaza, as ugly as it may be, it's war. It's a legitimate war. And by the way, war that was imposed on Israel by Hamas. Another example of the kind of relationship that could be cultivated with the 70% is celebrated filmmaker Quentin Tarantino, who's raising his son in Israel. Again, Tarantino, not Jewish, never been to Israel before he met his wife. Now he's raising a kid in Israel. He goes on American national television talking about his experience as a father in Israel during COVID, during a rocket attack, adding to the perception of Israel as simply a normal place. Now, we may not be as normal as other places, but Israel is certainly more normal than we think. If only given a chance, Israel could sell itself. Who needs to give Israel a chance? First of all, Israel's well-wishers, Israel's friends, Israel's supporters.